Thank you, Emil, for putting this together and for asking me to do this collection of images from Western art, which I found very fascinating. I've discovered many intriguing things and opened up for myself, and I hope for you, many questions. And I hope this conference will continue to be a collaborative effort, as it already is so obviously proved to be. Salome was both popular and outrageous in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Why was the theme itself so controversial? For the opera, there were 2 points of special dispute: the Dance of the Seven Veils and Salomé's kiss of the decapitated head. In the visual arts, there were related outrages. Beardsley's "I have kissed thy mouth, Yochanan," according to one historian, aroused more horror and indignation than any graphic work produced in England when it was published in the inaugural issue of the Studio in April 1893. In 1910, the National Academy of Design jury rejected Robert Henry's Salome, despite the fact that the painter was an academician of long standing. John Sloane, in his diary, said, "The Salome dancer with naked legs." Of course, the last was too much for them. But the National Academy of Design exhibitions included full-length nudes. The jury seems to have been making a last-ditch effort to prevent the vulgar, lowbrow commercial world of Salomania from spreading into the realm of fine art. How did Salome come to be associated with obsession and destruction and overt displays of sexuality? I will present a chronological survey of selected works of Western art, in which we can trace an evolution from Salome as a dutiful daughter embedded in a larger narrative, where her dance is a part of the action, to representations which condense the story into images of Salome herself. The head of St. John is a central feature, although in these no longer, but Salome's relation to it changes over time as the focus shifts from the beheading and the religious significance of the beheaded to the head itself, and the injury shifts from religious and physical to psychic and sexual. Salome's sexuality does not come to the fore until a period of Romanticism, where, linked with Orientalism, Salome becomes once again an alluring and dangerous other whose dance is a crucial part of the story. Later on, she was primarily a femme fatale, but she could also provide an identity for women defining their own sexuality, with or without the head. As, for instance, with Sadie Cohen, who left her happy home to become a hot Salome baby, to the horror of her boyfriend who yelled, "Oi, oi, 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 where's your clothes?" Earlier versions of Salome, or maybe I should say Herodias' daughter, treated her as an actor in a larger narrative. In A Capital from the Cloister of the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne, she offers the head of St. John to her mother, a central part of the story. Salome, as we've heard, is not even named in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Matthew's account doesn't say anything about the nature of the dance or the dancer, and makes it clear that it's the mother who wants St. John killed. As we've also heard, Flavius Josephus was apparently the first, and I guess he was the first, to refer to Salome by name. But he doesn't mention the dance or that she or her mother was responsible for the killing of John. This story opens up all kinds of complications, with Salome being Herod's stepdaughter and niece, her mother having left her natural father, Herod having left his first wife. Herod's and Herodias' marriage was of questionable legality and was condemned by St. John. This can be understood as a remarkably modern-looking dysfunctional family. And it's possible to read all kinds of relationships between Herod and his stepdaughter, Salome and St. John, Herodias and St. John, even Herod and St. John. All of these have been done in opera, novels, theater, popular culture, scholarly analyses, but these do not show up in visual images until relatively recent times. Medieval and Renaissance Salome appears as part of the life and death of St. John. The emphasis is not at all on her sexual allure, nor on her relationship with Herod or the Baptist. In Hildesheim Cathedral, Salome sways to musical accompaniment. She is, as in all of the pre-Mannerist depictions, modestly dressed. In some cases, she performs a kind of acrobatic act, and actually as she does in Flaubert's Herodias. In a British manuscript of the 12th century, she dances dramatically and dangerously with swords, perhaps anticipating the outcome of her dance, and once again presents the head of St. John to her mother after the execution. Virtuosity rather than sensuality would seem to be the appeal. As the nameless dancer, she figured in the Renaissance in the Feast of Herod, part of the life of St. John the Baptist. As Martha Dunkelman points out in an article on the innocent Salome, in the 14th and 15th century, she is often portrayed in art and writing as a relatively passive figure, sometimes emotionless or disengaged, as in Giotto's influential fresco of the Feast of Herod, which Lorenzo Monaco drew upon for his predella in Florence. The Renaissance Feast of Herod includes the dance, the beheading, and the presentation of the head, sometimes both to Herod and Herodias, in a single composition. According to Dunkelman, the relative neutrality in depictions like this is paralleled in late medieval and early Renaissance texts, which focus much less on Salome's contribution to the tragedy than Romantic writers or, as we've heard, the early church fathers did. The story and texts that were likely sources for artists placed much greater emphasis on the active role of Herod and Herodias, whose irregular marriage had been called into question by John the Baptist. Herodias' daughter is portrayed in these texts, as in the art they inspired, as a subsidiary, sometimes nameless vehicle of the biblical accounts. In the 14th and 15th century, two well-known chronicles of the life of St. John, the Golden Legend, and an anonymous Vita of the Baptist, were in common use. The description of the death of the saint in the Vita ascribes much advanced planning to Herod and Herodias. Herod, conquered by love for her, after his wife bursts into tears, agrees to go along with her plot to use Salome to bring about John's demise. The adults plan out the scenario in advance, down to Herod's feigned anger at Salome when she asks for the Baptist's head. They coach the girl about her role, which she undertakes with no objection, obedient to her mother. One detail that does not appear in the paintings, as far as I know, for her dancing, she has assistance from demons who appear during both the rehearsal and the actual performance. The Vita was known and used by various artists in the 15th century, showing the life of St. John, and can be assumed that it was influential in the interpretation of Salome. The dance, over time, becomes slightly more animated, but it does certainly not seem to be sexual or very expressive. In Fra Angelico's rendering, the dancer raises her arms and her sleeves swing, but this does not seem to be a dance that would cause Herod to give up half his kingdom, or St. John the Baptist. And the nature of the interchange between the girl dancing and her stepfather or uncle is also not made clear. In Benozzo Gozzoli's version, she actually looks at him, which is unusual. Dunkelman says that neither the Vita nor the Golden Legend contain any suggestions that Herod felt any real attraction to Salome. Donatello's Feast of Herod shows Salome dancing, but dramatically highlights the procession of the head through the wonderfully rendered perspectival architecture and its presentation to Herod. Salome seems to be simultaneously dancing and drawing back, reacting to the presentation of the severed head. In a second relief, Donatello gives us a glimpse of a whirling dancer clad in a diaphanous garment. But the dancing Salome in the background contrasts with the larger representation of her on the bench in front, where she seems to be drawing back in horror. Fra Filippo Lippi shows Salome's dancing as more active and flowing, with fluttering ribbons, but shows no interchange with Herod, who raises his hand in an enigmatic gesture. The presentation of the head is still a key feature of the story. Lippi has Salome look away in a gesture that would recur in the next century. The modestly dressed, dutiful daughter who dances at the behest of her mother and who is not involved in personal expression or seduction is in line with Renaissance ideas about the subservient role of women, as expressed, for instance, in Alberti's Delle Famiglie. Northern European representations of Salome from this period put much more emphasis on the violent beheading of St. John and show Salome receiving his head from the executioner. Roger van der Weyden shows the executioner and Salome turning their heads away from the gory spectacle. At the banquet in the background, she presents the head to her mother. Painted with the meticulous detail of Northern Renaissance, these scenes present the story in contemporary settings, with incurious spectators lounging on the side. And they ask us to think about how people of the time might be asked to consider the relation of the story to their own lives. Memling's altarpiece shows us a tiny vignette of Salome performing a remarkably unexpressive dance at the banquet, but emphasizes the execution and the transfer of the head to a seemingly indifferent Salome. Other Northern artists remove the scene entirely from the story of Herod, Herodias, and the banquet. A follower of Lucas van Leyden shows Salome receiving the head of St. John the Baptist out of doors. And Cranach shows a profusely bleeding body before a large entourage, which has a very ambiguous relationship to the Bible story. But clearly many references to contemporary culture. There's also the unpleasant detail of the dog lapping the blood. Cranach lived in an unsettled time. Can we see in these paintings of beheadings responses to the state of Europe on the eve of the 30 Years' War? The banquet doesn't entirely disappear in the North, but it can become very much a condensed, truncated version. Dührer's woodcut shows a voluptuous Herodias receiving the head in the presence of Herod. in a kind of family dinner. And alternative modes of presenting Salome show her alone with the head of St. John. This is a recurrent motif, and we'll see some later ones in the 19th and 20th century. The shift from a narrative presentation to the focus on the woman with the head leads us to ask how we can understand the condensation of this story, putting the focus on Salome alone, and how we can understand Cranach's presenting her in the dress and in the manner of a portrait of a wealthy woman of the time. Does this tap anxieties about women? There's also, in Cranach's work and the work of others, a cross-fertilization with the iconography of Judith, with the head of Holofernes. Judith, the virtuous killer, who had to make herself seductively attractive to save her people, operated at times as a counterpart to Salome. Cranach does not distinguish between them, showing one as virtuous and the other as evil. Baldung shows Judith with a head on a platter, like Salome's, suggesting this kind of blurring of boundaries between the two. She is suggestively draped in a transparent garment, displaying all the seductiveness that images of Salome have not had up to this time. In Italy, in the 16th century, the dancing Salome was separated from the story of Salome either receiving the head or contemplating it. Piero Ligorio shows a more active Salome who actually does seem to be dancing and twisting and showing some leg. In keeping with the more revealing clothing and the twisting poses of mannerism, 16th century Salomes appear more voluptuous. They are also detached from, in some cases, totally detached from the narrative of the life of St. John, the banquet and the dance. Although in their turns and gestures, they can suggest dance motions, as this Salome of Cesare de Sesto does. She gestures in an enigmatic way toward the head being placed in this basin. And the table leg has a voluptuous quality, which we can perhaps attribute to Salome as well, in actually the beginnings of sexualizing her. New compositional types focused on half-length depictions of Salome either holding the head of St. John or receiving it in the platter. These northern Italian artists worked under the influence of Leonardo, and their use of chiaroscuro served to dramatize a scene that was detached from the larger narrative. The enigmatic qualities associated with Leonardo's women become part of his followers' interpretations. Solario shows just the executioner's arm in a radical condensation of the subject to just signs of the various events. Bernardino Luini did multiple versions of this motif. It can be seen as a kind of cryptic emblem outside of time and space. Luini's figure looks away. Eleonora Baratti suggests that Salome's glance outside the frame may perhaps be understood not so much as her turning away from the gory head as an acknowledgement of the unrepresented but still powerful presence of Herodias. I favor a more open-ended reading, as this popular type could incorporate other variants and had other kinds of relationships between the executioner, Salome, and the head. Other characters who are not part of the biblical narrative appear in scenes in the 16th century. Titian did a version showing Salome glancing sideways at the head with a younger companion who is neither her mother nor the executioner. And in contrast to the ambivalent Leonardesque Salomés, Titian shows one raising the head in apparent triumph. Her posture suggests a dance movement at the same time. Her action accords with the incorporation of Salome into the pantheon of heroines. In the Baroque period, Salome was included in the typology of female heroines, some of whom were actively heroic, and many of whom came to tragic ends. Lucretia, Cleopatra, Susanna, and other famous women, including Judith and Salome, were very popular subjects. The distinction between women heroes and women villains loses clarity in these representations. Women were likely to be perceived perhaps as fallible or dangerous, whether their acts were good or bad. Interestingly, the gory decapitation is reserved for representations of Judith, especially in Caravaggio's circle and especially by Artemisia Gentileschi. The offering of the head to Salome by the executioner or another person becomes a central motif in the Italian Baroque. Caravaggio's Salome focuses not on the violence of the story, but seems to open up the possibility for a contemplation of its tragedy in a larger human context. The triad of the executioner, the expressive head of St. John, and the older woman is the emotional focus of the painting, even while the light draws attention to Salome, who averts her face. In some cases, a prison background provides a context for the action, which in Guercino's contemplative rendering of the scene is still outside of the biblical context in including the Salome's handmaiden. In other cases, the horror of the severed head or a contemplation of the tragedy of the situation it implies seems to give way to a courtly presentation in the company of people unrelated to the biblical story, and with graceful gestures on the part of Salome, perhaps evoking her dance. Rubens shows us that the banquet, with the interplay of Salome, Herod, and Herodias, was still an option in the North. No longer does this image combine multiple narratives, but focuses on the presentation of the head. Eastman, Moreau's champion, later accused Rubens of transforming Salome into a Flemish butcher. Rubens' interpretation is certainly different from the poetic evocativeness of the Italian versions. In a lost version by Rubens, represented in a print, the robust and maternal Herodias is in the center, flanked by the more delicate, blonde, youthful, and devoted figure of Salome. Salome does not seem to have had much currency in the 18th century, as far as I've been able to discover. A vaguely orientalizing drawing by Benjamin Wess suggests a shift in the location of the story, but not a radical rethinking, although the head of St. John is disturbingly small. Around the turn of the 19th century, however, under the influence of Romanticism, the Swiss-born British artist, Henry Fuseli, produced an image of Salome as an embodiment of dangerous sexuality in women, with an attendant behind her recalling her dance in the attendance movement. This overtly sexualized, scantily clad woman receives the head from another female figure, who is in turn seems to be getting taking it up from the executioner. She's called Daughter of Herodias in the title, but seems to be aware of her own powers and to be relishing the reception of the head. Fuseli, who famously painted nightmares, suggests that the significance of the story maybe lie entirely outside of the biblical narrative and somewhere in the disturbing interior of the psyche. Fuseli also depicted women as cruel sexual temptresses. Delacroix was a participant in the innovation of the 19th century to link Salomé, the Salomé story, with Orientalism. Biblical events had taken place in the Middle East, which was then subsumed in the general category of the Orient. Delacroix's Salomé is receiving the head from the executioner in a prison, and she's wearing a costume reminiscent of his North African women. Oops. Let me show you. Later versions supplied more specific detail. There were a large number of paintings of Salomé shown in the Salon in the 1870s. And Lévy's Hérodiade earned a gold medal in 1872. Here he shows, it's a focus still on the mother-daughter relationship. He shows a Salomé whose fluttering clothes suggest the possibility of dance movements and whose drooping neckline suggests the possibility of her body, her nakedness being revealed. But she's presenting the head to a kind of remarkably stoic, stolid mother, while the onlookers recoil, fall on the floor in horror. As Linda Nochlin says, in this case, she's referring to Sardanapalus, Delacroix's Sardanapalus, but talking about Orientalism, that the painting does not function as a field of ethnographic exploration. It is rather a stage for playing out from a suitable distance of forbidden passions. Regnault painted one of the first Salomés as a femme fatale. He based her on a peasant girl and actually hadn't initially thought of her as Salomé. He titled her successively Fauness, Hérodiade, and then Salomé. He stressed her Oriental lineage in showing her in exotic Eastern attire, seated on an Oriental footstool on a leopard skin rug, with long flowing hair disheveled from dancing. Regnault spoke of her caressing ferocity, which he saw as the base of her nature. He said she's a sort of black panther, tamed but always savage and cruel. And he spoke of her sadistic self-indulgence as she waits for the head to be placed on a charger. Regnault's painting inspired Théodore de Bonville's sonnet La Danseuse of 1870, dedicated to Regnault, which described Salomé in terms of sadistic sensuality. And this was also a part of the inspiration for Flaubert, whose Hérodiade would be published in 1877. Regnault's Salomé was criticized at the time for just being a gypsy. Other artists attempted to draw upon photographs and first-hand experience to produce a more realistic view of the Orient. This photograph of a alluring Algerian woman reclining belonged to Gustave Moreau, and who drew upon many sources, as we'll see in his Salomé versions. Georges Rochegros is typical of a particular kind of Orientalist artist. In drawing upon first-hand knowledge of the Middle Eastern architecture and artifacts, which he studied on several visits to Egypt and North Africa, and had recourse to photographs. And he painted scenes with an archaeological accuracy and using sumptuous color. These scenes have a convincing air of reality because of their precision and apparent transparency of style. The literary or historical sources for such scenes serve as pretext for sensational and titillating images, which attract and repel the viewer simultaneously. Rochegros's Salome is scantily clad and moves provocatively, dancing much more expressively than the other Salomés we've seen. Her gyrations are enhanced by the swirls on the floor. She holds an exotic flower and doves fly around her head. Her dark-skinned audience is spellbound. A leopard lounges in front of Herod, who lurks in the shadows of a throne. Lind Nachland said of Gérôme works, like many others of artworks of his time, his Orientalist painting managed to body forth two ideological assumptions about power. One about men's power over women, the other about white men's superiority to, hence justifiable control over inferior, darker races. Precisely those who indulge in this sort of regrettably lascivious commerce. We might say the male viewer was invited sexually to identify with, yet morally to distance himself from his Oriental counterparts, depicted within the objectively inviting, yet racially distancing space of the painting. Such voluptuous dancers appeared in other depictions of Salome in the 1870s and beyond. And it's here for the first time that we begin to see veils, or as I should say, unveils. Paul Baudry's Salome, part of the decoration for the new opera, seems to be taking off the very last of her veils. These connect with a type of nude who is shown scantily clad and contemplating the head or holding it. These in some ways recall the 16th century images, but are cast in a very different mode, an Orientalist one that distances them from the contemporary spectator. And this is Eastman House's only Salome, a later rendition of this motif. Gustave Moreau's painting of Salome dancing before Herod transformed the way of imagining the story. I'm indebted to a recent exhibition at the Hammer Museum, which highlighted this painting. Moreau presented it not so much as a narrative, but as a vision or a moment in time crystallized. His Salome was an extravagant canvas, worked on for a number of years and shown in the Salon of 1876. John and his head are nowhere to be seen. The masked and anonymous executioner is there, standing beside Herod, glancing furtively from the corner of his eye. So is a musician and an attendant, nestled in the gloomy atmosphere behind her. And there is a panther, a feline predator, over on the right. Herod is seated on a colossal throne in the middle of the picture. The throne takes up almost 2/3 of the painting. Salome, with her garments seeming to flutter as if she'd just completed a twirl, has come to a climactic stop in midair. Her toes, the toes of her right foot, hover just inches above the blood-red carpet. She raises her left arm in a dramatic gesture, pointing across the canvas into empty space at the upper right. And coming down from the left, a cascade of silvery light illuminates both her head and an empty space on the floor at the executioner's feet next to the deadly panther. The scene seems hallucinatory rather than descriptive, and to have a sense of foreboding. Moreau said, "Beauty is the invisible made visible through the expression, the attire that reveals the invisibles." Moreau has covered almost every inch of the luxuriant painting with elaborate filigree. Salomé's costume is especially sumptuous. The artist said he imagined her as a sibyl and a religious enchantress with a mysterious character. So he said, "I conceived the costume, which is like a reliquary." And that idea of the jewel encrusted with jewels is something that Eastman said of her. In his 1884 novel, A Rebours, translated as Against the Grain or Against Nature, the aesthete des Esseintes, who is withdrawn from the world in a quest for refined pleasure, acquires this painting and another, which we'll see. It is described with attention to the setting, with its overtones of cathedral or temple. And he noted the gleams of light reflected in Salomé's jewels, and imagined a scene heavy with perfume and a dance openly erotic but characterized by effects of light glimmering from the bracelets, rings, necklaces, pearl embroidery, gold and silver cloth, which moved with her as she danced. Eastman sees Salomé as a depraved temple dancer, but not as a specific one from a specific location, ambiguously Phoenician, Egyptian, Indian, and Byzantine in appearance and costume, whose lascivious sexuality is displayed principally in glints of light. Moreau's Salomé is the symbolic deity of indestructible lust, the goddess of immortal hysteria, cursed beauty, supreme above all other beauties by the cataleptic spasm that stirs her flesh and steels her muscles, a monstrous beast, indifferent, irresponsible, insensible, poisoning like Helen of old everything that approaches her. So Eastman was very much responsible for framing the femme fatale, the sexually alluring but dangerous, not just in her outward performance, but in all that she projects. His sources were extremely eclectic. Despite a fascination with the alien and exotic, he rarely left Paris and drew upon all kinds of imagery available to him in books and art collections, mixing together, as here, references to Egypt from Owen Jones and drawings of costumes from Asia. His Salomé dancing, or Salomé tattooed, shows the way in which he scratched with his brush and created a kind of filigree, which here covers the body of Salomé and was read as a tattoo, but in some way also dematerializes the materiality of the picture surface. Moreau's paintings were tour de force in indirect narrative and helped to launch the fin de siècle fixation on the femme fatale. by partly they involved a shift away from the exotic other to something strange and troubling but more immediate. And one way of thinking about the threatening woman in this context can be against the instabilities in the new Third Republic and the way in which the roles for men and women were changing. As women with less power could be seen as a symbol of the threatening upheavals in the established social order, so could the disturbing sexual power of Salome be connected with larger anxieties. Moreau's invention of the floating head as an apparition and obsession provided inspiration for a different way of thinking about the head of St. John. Rather than being a relic of a saint, a bloody reminder of an execution or a trophy, it becomes an abstraction, an open-ended symbol, but one that points to sexuality and obsession. In the hands of Redon's Salomé, the simplified and oddly unreal but still bloody head is a reminder of violence in a physical world and a narrative that seemed very far from the mysterious setting in which Salomé finds herself in this dreamlike space. The symbolist Lévy Durmer brought into focus the macabre sexual possibilities of the transformed story of Salomé in a pastel of 1896. The text on the upper left-hand corner is from Matthew and says the cut head was given to the young woman. The head, with rays emanating from it like Moreau's apparition, remains on the platter, which allows the kiss to have an overtone of vampiric devouring. The severed head appears in a number of other works, being kissed by Salomé, as in this Russian artist, about whom I know very little. It also could be conflated with the severed head of Medusa, giving visual form to fears in the male symbolist realm, but perhaps not only the male realm. This American artist showed her daughter as Medusa. Certainly, the hair of Beardsley's Salomé rise like snakes as she kisses the head of Yochanan, and his hair takes on an unnatural form. Munch shows himself drowning in the hair as a victim of Salomé with his own head in place of St. John's. Julius Klinger shows all too vividly the anxieties that Freud understood in relation to decapitation, complete with lunging panther. There were numerous other literary interpretations, which we're going to be hearing about, but Oscar Wilde's Salomé, which was written in French in 1891, crystallized the late 19th century fascination with a Herodias Salomé theme and fixed Salomé's cruelty and perverse desire in the public's mind. He provided the inspiration for Beardsley's drawings, which, like most of the late 19th century works, depart radically from the biblical narrative, and in his case, even from Wilde's play. The uncertainties about the nature of Salomé and her relation to others are vividly present in his work, as for instance here, where she and Yochanan are almost doubles. The sense of identification or absorption, rather than distancing from Salomé, is a feature of much of Salomé culture in the turn of the 20th century. Perhaps these uncertainties are a feature of representations of this elusive character throughout Western art, especially as we look back at it with our 21st century perspective. And I look forward to ways in which all of us can make sense of this by the threads we all bring together. Thank you. Yes?
I have a question. One of your examples came from the Oratorio di San Giovanni de Colasso.
Right.
And I just wondered what kind of observance or worship or new thinking about John, the headless John.
I don't know. That's a very interesting question. And to what extent there is a Salome component in it, or to what extent it completely focuses on other things.
I thought I had seen almost every church in Rome, but it's impossible.
Right.
It might be right here, but I didn't know about that.
Yeah.